Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Here's a quote for you. Downright dangerous. That's how one Republican described the Equality Act after the House passed the bill yesterday. Others warn it will trample on religious freedom.
It could also mean the beginning of the end of women's sports as we know them. So what can we expect as the bill heads to the Senate? Eric Phillips has more on this controversial move.
Not only do opponents warn the Equality Act will create enormous problems for religious freedom, they also say it could be the beginning of the end of women's sports as we know them, because it allows transgender women who are biologically male to compete against biological women.
On this vote, the yeas are 224 and the nays are 206. The bill is passed.
The bill cleared the House Thursday with only 3 Republicans crossing party lines to support the Democrat-sponsored bill.
This is a sad day for women's rights here in the United States of America. It is a disgrace, it is disgusting, and it's downright dangerous.
The legislation expands the 1964 Civil Rights Act by broadening the definition of protected classes to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Congressman David Cicilline, who is gay, sponsored the bill.
Every American deserves respect and dignity, and it's important that the Equality Act become law because it will once and for all ensure that LGBTQ Americans can live lives free of discrimination.
Opponents say the problem is the legislation ignores religious freedom in many ways, including requiring doctors to perform procedures like gender reassignment, even if it goes against their beliefs, and that it would allow children to make life-altering sex change decisions.
Parents who choose not to subject their child to puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, they could have their children removed from their custody.
Beyond that, the bill allows biological men who identify as women to use women's bathrooms and locker rooms and compete in women's sports, jeopardizing scholarships for female athletes.
This bill has the potential to devastate women's sports. I mean, we want everyone to play the game, but we want everyone to play fairly, quite literally on a level playing field.
The truth is, this notion of trans women in sports being some threat is just a non-existent issue. There's no evidence that trans women are winning in competitive sports at a greater rate than cis women. There's no evidence.
But that's not the case in Connecticut, where a similar law already exists. There, more than a dozen women's state track championship titles have been won by biological males in the last few years, leading to a lawsuit from female athletes. Still, supporters say the bill is overdue.
This legislation is personal for me. Just 6 years ago, LGBTQ Americans like my daughter won the legal right to marry who they love. The Equality Act would make sure she can continue living her life with her wife with the security and dignity of knowing she won't face basic discrimination because of who she is.
Next, the bill heads to the Senate, where it will face a tough road because it appears the Republican votes needed to overcome a filibuster just aren't there. Still, the White House is pushing for its passage because the president wants to sign this bill into law in his first 100 days. Eric Phillips, CBN News.
Well, this was a campaign promise by Joe Biden, and definitely he wants it within the first 100 days, which is why we're seeing it fast-tracked in the middle of this pandemic and getting the population vaccinated. Will it pass the Senate? I don't know. But without a religious exemption, there's nothing equal about this law. If you don't have the right to exercise your conscience in what you believe based on your religious belief, and that's whether you're Muslim or Mormon or Christian or Orthodox Jew, it doesn't, the act has no protection for you at all. So we're going to see a fair amount of litigation following this, just as we saw litigation after Obamacare and the mandate to provide for conception services, which means abortion, within your health plan. And so the Little Sisters of the Poor were forced under that. They went through all kinds of litigation and ultimately had it decided in the Supreme Court. that gets very expensive. And so will this have that same kind of scrutiny? My guess is yes. And because it's not really an Equality Act, there's an ideology that's being forced, and there's an agenda behind it, and they are going to use it as a very big hammer. In other news, the U.S. launched airstrikes in Syria yesterday. It was the first military action of the Biden administration. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. The Pentagon said the strikes were in retaliation for a rocket attack in Iraq earlier this month against a base with U.S. soldiers in which 5 Americans were wounded. The U.S. airstrikes targeted buildings officials say are owned by militias backed by Iran. The U.S. believes those groups were behind the recent attacks against Americans in Iraq. The White House says the president's action wasn't meant to indicate more military involvement in the region, but to signal that the United States will defend its troops in Iraq. Well, here at home, some health experts are concerned about a new variation of the COVID-19 virus spreading quickly in New York City. The New York Times reporting it carries a mutation that may weaken the effectiveness of vaccines. Still, researchers emphasize they don't yet know if this new variant is any more contagious or deadlier than others. Both Moderna and Pfizer already are modifying their vaccines to resist the South African variant. Well, with skyrocketing use of the internet during the COVID lockdowns, online sexual exploitation of children has been on the rise. The center that investigates this trend has just released this year's Dirty Dozen list. CBN's Paul Strand has the story.
We've known for years how pornography makes billions through the web. In looking at this year's National Center on Sexual Exploitation Dirty Dozen, the connection of giants like Amazon, Netflix, and Chromebooks to sexual exploitation should set off major alarms in homes across the country.
In a sad example of how the pandemic has put millions more children at risk of exposure to porn or being sexually exploited is the soaring use of Google Chromebooks for distance learning. But their safety features are often left turned off, or children find workarounds.
Parents and teachers often don't even realize that there's a problem until a student has shared pornography with another student, or they notice changes in their children.
Reddit calls itself the front page of the internet, but those releasing this year's Dirty Dozen charge that Reddit acts more like a back page, as it serves as a hub where sex buyers find people to purchase and sexual predators distribute hardcore pornography as well as non-consensually share images. Amazon's high ranking this year is due to the amount of sexual-themed material sold by the retail giant and the nudity and sex on Amazon Prime Video. There's also an issue with the way children are often targeted on Amazon's gamers platform, Twitch.
The number of children on the platform are below the minimum legal age. There are frequent conversations between children and strangers, with strangers daring kids to do explicit acts or to share their contact information.
OnlyFans made the Dirty Dozen list because many young people thrown out of work by the pandemic now use OnlyFans to sell images or videos of their bodies to make fast cash. Nevada returns to the list because of its legalized brothels. And Netflix is there because of the amount of sexually graphic or degrading content it continues to make available. Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul. Well, turning overseas, the United Nations group responsible for overseeing education for Palestinian refugees recently said it had removed violent and anti-Israel content from school text. A new investigation questions that resolution, finding those changes don't go far enough. CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell brings us that story.
During 2020, Palestinian children, like many others around the world, couldn't go to school due to COVID-19. During that time, United Nations Relief Works Agency, or UNRWA, produced and provided the students material that went way beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic.
We found that it contains various violations of UN values, of UNESCO standards, and of UNRWA's own principles. These were educational materials which were distributed to over 320,000 Palestinian children across the West Bank and Gaza.
Marcus Sheff leads a group that monitors peace and cultural tolerance in schools. It examined the material sent to those children, and what they found was not good.
The idea that UNRWA, a UN organization, is distributing material which calls on students to defend the motherland with blood, or that glorifies terrorists and directs students to terrorists like Dalal Mughrabi, who is in their materials a role model for young girls, somebody who murdered 38 people, including 13 children on a civilian bus.
This impact group report from January lays out examples found throughout the curriculum. In mathematics, students are asked to write the number of martyrs in the First Intifada. A language studies question asks students to find the preposition in a sentence like, "Jihad is one of the doors to paradise." And in social studies, where Zionist policy is blamed for exhausting Palestinian natural resources.
It was written by UNRWA's teachers. Now, UNRWA's teachers are supposed to be trained in UN values of peace and tolerance.
Following the January impact report, UNRWA admitted to the problem and assured governments it had been addressed. A follow-up study by the impact team, however, shows that was not the case.
Within these materials, we also found hateful material which young people anywhere should not be studying, and certainly not being taught by a UN organization. So, I think what we see here is that, UNRWA is absolutely part of the problem in relation to the incitement of young people in the region.
In one social studies exercise, 6th graders are shown a map of the British Mandate called Palestine that does not include any Israel reference, and told Palestine is the geographical area which extends from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the River Jordan in the east, and from Lebanon and Syria in the north to the Gulf of Aqaba and Egypt in the south. Its location gave it strategic importance, making it coveted by invaders and colonial powers. And there's another problem.
And that is, if you've distributed print materials to 320,000 children, then you found that you had been distributing hateful material, how exactly did UNRWA get those materials back? We have no answer to that.
Former President Trump cut funding to UNRWA because of this kind of incitement in Palestinian schools. President Biden has pledged to resume humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. Chef maintains the world should expect transparency from any United Nations body. And until UNRWA can prove otherwise, it should be understood the organization teaches hate. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris. Gordon, this agency, UNRWA, is one that you've put in the spotlight many times in the past.
I think UNRWA needs to go away. It shouldn't exist anymore. It's an agency specifically crafted by the UN way back in 1948, 1949 to handle the, quote, refugee problem. And the refugees were created. These were people that left when Israel declared its independence. And the reason they left is the surrounding Arab nations asked them to leave, that they didn't want civilian casualties because they were declaring war on Israel. And so Israel declared its independence. A few hours later, the Arab nations declared war. And they never expected to lose that war. Well, they did, and they've kept losing wars ever since. But refugees created by that situation, we shouldn't perpetuate it, which is exactly what's happening today, where there's still Palestinian refugee camps where people are living this limbo, where they're not citizens, they're not of any nation state. And what does that mean for employment? What does that mean for their future? They're literally kept in limbo and used as pawns, which is just horrible. And this isn't something new. It goes back generations. We're now in the 5th generation of so-called refugees. The UN was never crafted for this. Refugee status was never created for this. It's time to say this needs to be over. So let's end it. And certainly our tax dollars shouldn't go for incitement material and teaching little kids to hate Jews. That our tax dollars should have nothing to do with that. But let's get smart about this. The old adage, the Palestinians have never refused an opportunity. They've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They've been given the opportunity to have a state. They've been given an opportunity to come to peace with Israel. They've refused it every time, and it's time to say, well, if you're going to always do this and never come to peace with your neighbor, well, let's move on. That said, I'm always in favor of humanitarian relief to people, particularly people that have been used as pawns, that have been exploited by their own leaders. So what about food? What about water? What about shelter? What about employment? What about opportunity? How can we provide that? But we can't provide it through these existing systems because all they do is perpetuate the lie that somehow there's going to be a return, somehow or other Israel is going to be driven into the sea. All of this needs to end.